Thracia 776 is the 5th entry in the Fire Emblem series and is simultaneously one of the best the series has to offer while also being one of the least played. I can't really blame people for this. The game never came out in the West, and even in Japan it came out in 1999 for the SNES, so that's 3 years after the Nintendo 64 came out. Plus, the game is kind of an AU of FE4, so you probably want to play that one before Thracia, and Thracia is also often touted as one of the hardest games in the series, so there are a lot of barriers to entry. However, we now have the power of fan translation and emulation, and while Thracia is challenging, it's not as bad as you may have heard. I promise you can handle it, and it's really rewarding if you give it a chance. Thracia is one of the most unique games in the series, and at its peak, it's brilliant. I think you'll really enjoy it, and here's why. I'm going to start off with minimal plot spoilers, but I'm going to talk about the basic premise and the mechanics in the map design that makes Thracia tick. I'll give a heads up when I'm going to get into more serious plot spoilers so that you can leave if you don't want to hear those. Thracia follows Leif, who you may be familiar with from Fire Emblem 4 as the funny project unit with an awesome promotion. Well, in Thracia that fella is our lord, and he aims to build a rebellion strong enough to restore the kingdom of his birthright. It takes place between Generation 1 and 2 of Fire Emblem 4, and you're going to see a lot of familiar faces here if you played that game, so definitely check that one out first. The game starts off like many Fire Emblem games do, with evil soldiers attacking a city in a pretty straightforward map. But that's great because Thracia has some new mechanics that you'll want to familiarize yourself with, and this is a nice, calm environment for you to do that in. The first big new mechanic is capture. You can attack units like usual, but if you have higher constitution than them, you can also attempt to capture them. When you try to capture an enemy, you make an attack with all of your stats halved, and if you knock the enemy to 0 HP, you capture them instead of killing them. This is sort of like rescuing, except you're holding an enemy instead of an ally. And the main reason you want to do this is because when you capture an enemy, you can take all of their stuff, including their weapons, consumables, anything they have on them. This is one of the main ways that you're going to acquire items and gear in Thracia. Thracia isn't a game that really hands out gold for you to spend in shops. Instead, you'll need to capture enemies so that you can take their weapons to equip your soldiers, or sell them so that you can buy gear that you want. The neat thing about capture is that it lets you get almost any item an enemy can have. In other games, sometimes enemies will have things like status staves or siege tomes that you can't get your hands on because they don't drop them. In Thracia, if you can get to the enemy before they use up their cool item and capture them, then that item is yours. And this kind of turns enemies with cool items into side objectives. An enemy with a good item is suddenly someone you might go out of your way to go fight, even if they're dangerous, just so that you can get your mitts on their good loot. There's just one thing to note about capture, which is that if an enemy doesn't have a weapon, you can capture them without attacking, but this applies to you too. If you leave a staff user out in the open, an enemy will come scoop them up and take all their items, and you'll have to capture them back to get your things back. You can plan around enemy capturing though, and strategize with it. If you trade away a unit's items and unequip them, you can bait an enemy into capturing instead of attacking, and you won't lose any items. So that's capturing, and before too long we get our first thief and our next big mechanic, which is stealing. And if you've played other Fire Emblem games, you might be thinking, well, we have stealing in other Fire Emblem games. But not like in Thracia. In Thracia, in addition to unlocking doors and chests, thieves can steal items from enemies, including weapons, provided the thief's constitution is higher than the item's weight. Your first thief has enough constitution to steal tomes from mages by default, making him a unit that can actually contribute to combat by just taking away the only weapons some enemies have. So thieves will be another important part of your team for acquiring gear and consumables. They can even make capturing easier because remember, if an enemy is unequipped, you can capture them for free without making an attack. So if an enemy mage has a cool item that you want, you can steal their tome and then have someone else capture them with no risk of seeing a counterattack. Stealing and capturing are the first two new big features in Thracia, and what I love about capturing and stealing is how they fit into the atmosphere the story is creating. We aren't a proper army at the start of the game. We're a ragtag group of soldiers and regular people. So it makes perfect sense that we can't just buy weapons and healing items. Instead, we have to scrounge by and make do with what we can get for ourselves. Capturing and stealing acting as your main source of income is one of the earliest examples of the excellent synergy between Thracia's narrative and its gameplay. There are a bunch of other little mechanics that are new to Thracia that I don't want to get into here, but I've linked a lovely infographic in the video description that goes over all the little unique features Thracia has to offer. We see some more of Thracia's great narrative gameplay synergy during the first chapter. If you send most units to the house to the south, they get nothing. But the villagers there will tell you that it's the home of Orson, one of your units, and if he goes to visit the house, he gets an awesome unique axe. Thracia is full of a lot of little things like this that make the game world feel a little more lived in to me. It's a fiction-first approach to storytelling that I really appreciate. And you should pay attention to what happens in Chapter 1 because it sets the tone of Thracia really well. There's all sorts of little events like Orson's house, and usually the story will hint at them. Thracia is known for having a lot of mean gotcha moments, and those definitely exist, but a lot of them are hinted at in the text, so you're definitely rewarded for paying attention in this game, and you can feel pretty big brain when you can figure out what the story is trying to hint at you to do in the map. That said, those gotcha moments I mentioned are a big part of why Thracia is thought of as one of the more difficult games in the series. The game features ambush spawns or enemy units that move immediately after spawning, infinite range status staves, easily missable guidance and recruitments, and a few mean tricks during chapters such as invisible warp tiles. And some of those are as bad as they sound. Ambush spawns are as annoying as they are in every other game, and the invisible warp tiles are dumb, though fortunately they're only featured on 2 optional maps. I think people look at the missables the wrong way though. You can miss a lot of recruitments and guidance, but none of these missables are required, and in fact, the game gives you so many units and so many resources are available that it feels like the developers intended for you to miss some of them. In my playthrough that I did to make this video, I missed 10 recruitments and multiple guidance, but I still managed just fine because there are so many capable units in Thracia. Especially since the game gives you items that can increase a unit's growths, so it's easy to make anyone you want into a great combat unit. Basically, yes, there are a lot of missables, you're going to miss some things on your first playthrough, but you shouldn't stress about them. Thracia is very beatable while missing all of the difficult to recruit characters, and you're probably not going to miss all of them, you're just going to miss some on your first playthrough. Things like infinite range status staves are sort of a double-edged sword in terms of difficulty. They are absolutely powerful tools that the enemies have at their disposal, but remember, any item an enemy has can be yours with a capture. So while one chapter may be difficult because of an enemy's sleep staff or warp staff, you can always take that item for yourself and use it to make a later map easier. So Thracia is difficult, but not soul-crushingly difficult, and it's easier than a lot of the harder games in the series. You'll definitely reset a few times on your first playthrough, but I think you'll find it to be a pretty rewarding experience in totality. You can look up a guide if you want, if you're going to find the missables too frustrating, but I actually do recommend playing this game mostly blind. The one thing that I think you should know is that you should buy door keys as soon as you can. You might think that you don't need them because you have Thieves, but you will be happy you bought the door keys, trust me. My absolute favorite part of Thracia, though, isn't the difficulty or the new mechanics, it is how bold the designers were with the map designs in this game, and how those maps often perfectly fit what's going on in the narrative. My favorite map in Thracia, and perhaps the entire series, is Chapter 4. This map is a prison break. Half your units start in prison cells with no items on their person, and there's a trio of green units in a prison with your thief. Then you get 3 new blue units here to help break you out of prison. There's also a bunch of civilians that you can break out and help escape. What's interesting about this map, though, is that it is mostly about avoiding combat and optimizing how you move your units. Reinforcements are going to be on the way once you start breaking out, so you want to grab these chests around the map as soon as possible, which means you're going to have to think about how you move your characters so that you can get all of your stuff as quick as possible. Ideally, you want to get your stuff and save these citizens before the reinforcements stack up too much and before all of your green units die while they're distracting the guards. The map manages to create tension while really de-emphasizing combat, and I think that's a really impressive thing. The tension comes to a head once you've helped all the civilians escape and you make a mad dash out of the map with reinforcements spawning behind you and the guards of the prison in front of you. It's a really exciting ending to the map, and it's a little tricky the first time. A lot of people have a tough time with this last bit of the map. And it's when you get to the last bit of the map that you'll notice that the map has my favorite objective in the series, escape. Escape in Thracia functions sort of like Seize, where you need to get your lord to a specific square to end the map. However, your other units can also use that square to escape. The lord escaping will end the map, but anyone that you've left on the map that hasn't escaped will be captured, and you'll have to make do without them for a long time before you can get them back. I think this is such a cool objective because it fits the narrative of our ragtag group of soldiers perfectly, They're running from a powerful force, so we shouldn't be seizing, we should be running away. And Leif has to be the last man out if you want to save everyone, which makes him feel a little more heroic than an escape objective might if he just had to escape first. The escape objective does a few interesting things mechanically. One is that it prevents you from skipping maps in the same way that you can seize maps. In a seize map, you can just warp a unit to the seize point or go there as fast as possible with one unit. But in Escape, all of your units need to make it to the escape point. However, Escape also gives players a fair amount of choice, because if you're struggling with a map or you're struggling to get everyone to the end of the map, you do have the option of ending the map with Leif at any time at the cost of leaving a soldier or two behind. It's a really interesting dynamic that I enjoy a lot, even if I usually set a goal to save all of my units. Escape fits Chapter 4 perfectly, and it's a big part of why I love the map so much. Chapter 4 tests so many Fire Emblem skills, from good movement to inventory management to combat at the end of the map. And you need to approach it a little differently than most other maps in the series, which makes it one of my favorite maps to replay every time I boot up Thracia. Anyway, that's where I'm going to stop with the spoiler-free section. To touch on the rest of why Thracia is brilliant, I need to talk about the plot a little bit. So if you're already sold on Thracia, go play it. You don't need spoilers. But for the rest of you, the spoiler section starts now. Chapter 4 is one of my favorite maps in the series, but I really want to talk about another map later in the game. Chapter 19, which tells the best narrative that has ever been told in a single chapter. Chapter 19 comes after the biggest triumph of the story thus far. Leif and his army have retaken Leonster, which is Leif's birthright. However, as Leif celebrates his victory, he gets news that the allied kingdom of Ulster is under attack from the Empire. Leif's advisors warn him that they don't have the manpower to help, but Leif demands they go anyway. Leif agrees to send half his forces now and follow up with the remainder of his forces tomorrow. Following this is a bone-chilling moment where Leif's advisors, August and Dryas, debate which of them is going to join the forward army and who will follow along with Leif the next day. After a couple lines of their conversation, you realize they're not really debating who's going to join the vanguard, they're debating which one of them is going to die. And both of them want to join the vanguard so that the other can live to continue guiding Leif. It's a beautifully executed, somber moment that shows how much respect these advisors have for each other, even though they've been bickering for most of the playthrough. The next morning comes, and Leif gets news that the vanguard, including Dryas, have been slaughtered. Dryas, an important and plot-relevant character, dies suddenly and off-screen. With worse execution, this might have felt a bit disappointing. But in Thracia, this feels like the perfectly natural consequence of Leif's decision. Leif's choice has robbed Dryas of his life, and while other characters describe his death as heroic, we experience how little that's worth as a character that we liked is suddenly gone, not to be heard from again. Finally, we get to play the chapter, which revolves around rescuing what's left of the vanguard, and it's an interesting map. Half your army spawns on the front lines near the enemy, while everyone else spawns right next to the escape point. Thracia's escape mechanic again works brilliantly here. You have the option to clear the map immediately. You can leave with your units that spawn near the escape point and leave the vanguard to be captured. But you can also send your troops down to try and rescue them and save the local villages from bandits. There are a few ways to trivialize the map. If you have enough horses and flyers, you can get the vanguard away from the enemy, no problem. You can also field some weaker units that you don't mind using to distract the enemies while the rest of the vanguard escapes. It's not an overly difficult map, but it's a great way to experience what's happening in the story, and I was devastated the entire time I played it on my first playthrough. I'm not going to go through every map that has great gameplay story integration, but it's something Thracia excels at, and Chapter 4 and 19 really benefit from it. Chapter 19 in particular only works because of how well it integrates the story with the gameplay. And of course, all of this only works because the story is good and filled with compelling characters. I do want you to play this game, so I'm not going to go into detail on the whole story, but I do want to talk a bit about my favorite character, and it's not a playable one. My favorite character is our tactician, August. August joins us early in the game and is instrumental to Leif's growth as a character because he helps connect Leif to the experiences of the common man. Early in FE5, you fight a group of bandits that are harassing innocents. Typical Fire Emblem stuff, but what happens after is interesting. Leif laments having to fight the bandits and complains that the bandits should have just been honest men instead. Instead of validating him, August tells Leif that he's unaware of his privilege and shows how that socioeconomic conditions force people in the area to turn to thieving or else starve. All throughout the game, August is giving Leif regular reality checks and forging him from a naive noble to an empathetic king. We see Leif become much wiser by the end of the game, and it's in large part due to August's teachings. August is also often representing the common man and the will of the people, as opposed to Leif's other advisor, Dryas, who is a little more knightly and concerned with things like honor and valor. We can see that in the mid-game when Dryas recommends the army make a direct attack on the enemy, claiming that anyone who dies will die heroically. August reminds him that the army is full of commoners who don't want to die, heroically or otherwise. August is my favorite mentor character in the series, and I love seeing how Leif learns from his teachings and becomes the hero that the people need him to be. Almost every major character influences Leif's development, and it makes him one of the best lords in this series. The game isn't afraid to let Leif fail, but it also shows us how he learns from his failures and eventually triumphs. Now, not everything in Thracia is a masterstroke, and it's only fair that I talk about some of the less good things. The neat thing about the bad parts of Thracia is that they are unique, and some of them were even iterated on in future Fire Emblem games. For example, Thracia actually introduced defense maps to the series. This mid-game map involves defending a city for 10 turns, and this is the original do-nothing defense map. The enemies spawn infinitely, so all you need to do to beat the map is stick 3 decent combat units in the choke points near the defense point. There are a couple incentives to push out, notably one village has a really neat spear for your new Wyvern Knight. Pushing out to get this is an interesting challenge, but also we have access to warp and rescue at this point in the game, and they have infinite range, so you can just get it that way. So this isn't my favorite map, but it did introduce defense maps to the series, for better or for worse depending on how you feel about them. Something else that Thracia introduced that thankfully isn't seen in almost every Fire Emblem game after it is warp tiles. There are 2 maps that use warp tiles. They're hidden spaces that warp you to set locations. And the first map where these exist isn't that bad, but in the second one, stepping on a warp tile teleports you to a closed room with no escape, and the map objective is escape. So I hope you have a rescue staff with you, or any unit that gets warped into that room is done for. Fortunately, both of these maps are optional, but one of them is really plot relevant, so you're probably not going to want to miss it. Thracia does also have several maps that have some pretty big gotcha moments, the worst of which is when you attack this fort defended by a boss named Kempf. Once Leif steps into the courtyard, all the doors lock and some ballistas appear. The ballistas are strong enough to one-shot your thief, so if you didn't bring door keys or think to steal them from the guards before entering, you're going to have a pretty hard time here. There are also some recruitments that you're very likely to miss on your first playthrough. How much of a problem that is depends on what type of player you are. I really don't mind missing a unit here or there, but if you're a completionist, there are a lot of things that can trip you up in Thracia. Still, despite these issues, I think Thracia is a must-play. It's one of the best narratives in the series, and its unique mechanics like capturing and stealing items are really fun, and you won't find them in other Fire Emblem games. On top of that, while there are some weird bad moments in the gameplay, they're made up for by the brilliant maps by Chapter 4 that you just don't see in other games. I think the great moments in Thracia outweigh the bad moments tremendously. For those reasons, I really hope you'll give Thracia a shot. It's a great game, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. So go check it out, it's really fun. If you've played Thracia, what do you think about it? And if you haven't, what's holding you back? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you liked the video and want to see more like it, consider hitting the like and subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, and have yourself an awesome week.